just trying to figure out how much grading we have to do.
A lot.
So the optional revision, as I told you in class last time, the deadline was extended to Sunday around midnight to give you some extra time to finish that. And when is your prototype due? Thursday night. And the questions that I'm having about your prototype are all along the same lines. Like, do we model one task? Do we have to have 10 screens? Do they have to be unique screens? Well, if our task is really simple, do we do 2 tasks? So, to answer your questions, realize that in your assignment instructions, it's kind of like guidelines too. The reason I said 10 screens as a minimum is because I want you to gauge the level of complexity of your prototype. Like some of you, for instance, there's one app that was and may still be named Streamline that's being developed for the elderly people to basically make your smartphone into a dumb phone so that older users could actually use it, right? So for them, I told them you might want to actually model a few different tasks because literally just like opening up the phone and the launcher and then clicking dial and having a dial pad for a phone, that's not going to be enough to convince, you know, your venture capitalists to say, okay, this is enough functionality to show me the feasibility, the usefulness, the novelty of this mobile app, okay? So for an app that's simple like that, where one task could literally be like one click, then I would want you to model a few different tasks and show like the different functionality that you're building into your system. There's other groups that have more complex things that they want to do, such as apps for disabled students to learn how to read that might require more than 10 screens. And more for the prototype is always welcome and better, okay? So more is better in this case. So it's not more, less is more, it's more is more. Please do more work than I'm requiring of you. That's always seen as a good thing. So the 10 screens is really just a keep an eye out for how complex your task is, because I wanted to have at least some medium level of complexity to really showcase what your app could do, okay? So again, that 10 is like a guideline to say, okay, you pretty much, if you have less than 10 screens, then you probably haven't modeled enough stuff to actually say, okay, this is a good video demo, okay? But you can always go for more too. Last semester I had some prototypes, they had 20, 40 slides with different screens on them, okay? So what I really want you to look at is not the letter of the law of like I have to have 10 screens. I want you to think about, okay, let me step back from my app for a second and say, what are we going to show these people who've never seen our app before, what our app can do to show them and convince them that this, hey, this is a great idea, right? So for some of you where you have multiple tasks that maybe go together, for instance, we have an app for dementia, Alzheimer's, elderly caregiving, which is for the caregivers. So they might show getting a notification and being able to deal with that notification, but then also showing how you can use the intercom feature to mobily like say something to a speaker to the elderly person to check to make sure they're okay, or to check the surveillance camera to see if it's okay, right? So if you want to combine multiple tasks, that's a good thing. Just make it clear what you're modeling in your first slide and say, this is the task that you can perform using this prototype. And that task needs to be something that's important enough to say, okay, this is like the crux of what this app does and why it's valuable. Does that answer your question? Any other questions about your prototypes? Joe. Half the time I call you Joe, half the time I call you Joseph.
So with this being said, like, would you grade against possibly if we just felt like doing 2 tasks?
You're welcome to do 2 tasks. What I might, like, the only reason that would be a problem is if you were one of those apps that I told you and then like the second task was the teacher going to the forum and posting about how, and then I would say these tasks aren't very cohesive, and so it's kind of going with the whole, some of you got the feedback of your features are all over the place, pare them down and keep it tighter and more cohesive. So if you do that, I would say, okay, rethink what you're modeling, but try to make the things more cohesive. Does anybody understand, does everybody understand when I say the word cohesive, what that means? Somebody give me a definition.
Like things that go together.
Right, things that go together and that help solve the same problem.
Things that make sense together.
Things that make sense together. Perfect. Okay, good, because I wasn't losing you with my polysyllabic word. Okay, cool. There was a question over here first. So, Corinne, right?
Can you clarify what you mean by screen? Do you mean like the entire?
So in your prototype, you're going to actually prototype where it shows the entire phone screen, okay? And then each screen has a slot, right? And so you want to do something like be able to show like backwards functionality, like going back. Sometimes when you're prototyping, you have to have separate screens just to like simulate things like text entry, right? So I'm literally not going to be sitting there counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 screens and comparing to make sure they're unique or not. I'm going to be looking at it from more the perspective of was there tasks or were these tasks? Okay? So I would consider like the best way in this class is say, okay, well, if the requirement's 10, for good measure, let's have it. Just because we want to make this work. Or even better, you can come to my office and I can so I would like you to embed it in the phone.
So you want to see a phone?
Yeah, because like for instance, being able to click the back button for some apps is really important. That's more for Android than iPhones, but yeah.
Okay, so the home version.
Yeah. Because like iPhones just have the big button that just brings you back to the central, right? Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if other groups would have the same situation, but we have a lot of changes that probably would be reflected in the revision, like switching from Android to iOS. You have to specify that somewhere, like the changes.
That's a great question. So in this class, I encourage you to be flexible and to change, right? So like sticking to your original idea and like holding to it with a death grip is not the best way to do user-centered design, right? So in that, I realize there might be some discrepancies of the revision that you, or not even necessarily the revision, but like the documentation that you submitted versus what your prototype's going to be, okay? And I went painstakingly through all of your documentation, and so I have this idea in my mind, and there's going to be some incongruence if I see a prototype that's like something completely different, right? So what you should do if you make major strategic decisions like that in your prototype, the one where you're annotating it with all your design justifications, put like a first slide of saying some key changes, right? We decided to change from this to this because of this, okay? And that way, before I even open your prototype, or the TAs open your prototype, we'll be like, okay, so this is what I'm going to expect. So it's great to make changes that make sense. Just document them when you do. Yeah.
I know that in the documentation they said that we can't, doesn't have to be perfect the first time around. Can we still get like a good?
So for the prototype deliverable, the way that I made the grade is that the first prototype that you do is going to be worth 20%, right? And then your final one is going to be 80%. So it's going to be graded as one deliverable instead of two. Because if I grade it as two separate grades, kind of like the project documentation, then it would be a lot more work for you, whatever. So the reason that I did it that way is because I know that your first prototypes even if I made a prototype today, it's going to have flaws, okay? But the major things, look at the rubric that I put in there that I'm looking for, are the same things that I graded you on in your, except for aesthetics, because you didn't have any much aesthetics in your, or intuitiveness, because you didn't have the flow. But I'm looking at the feasibility, the usefulness, and what was the other one? Novelty of your task. So if you had those problems in your project documentation and you didn't fix it, then you'd probably get some points counted off for that.
So are we gonna focus on Android devices? Grading more on the task in the initial?
So look in the rubric, because I did put in there like what's your task, the feasibility, but you are going to, so the main things that you're going to be graded on is like the logical flow, like is it intuitive from click to click, the aesthetics, is it a high fidelity prototype as opposed to like a wire screen mock-up, and then the other things are the feasibility, the usefulness, the same things from the project documentation to make sure you resolve those issues.
And the same with the final?
And the final, the other 80% is going to be that, but as well grading your final version, and then how well you address all of the feedback that you got from your original prototypes. Okay? So it's going to be kind of like a delta, the change between the first one to the second one. So your improvement is going to overall help your grade 2. The reason that I said not to treat your initial prototype as like a blow-off initial, because it's only 20% of the project grade, is why. Well, it's the starting point for the final prototype. So you don't want to have to scrap it and start over. It's 20% of that one grade, but what else? Okay, right. So your video demo is going to be based off of your initial prototype, and that's going to be something that I'm going to have the entire class give you feedback on and grade you on. And that's what I'm going to give you feedback on for me, because I'm not grading your initial prototype, right? You're just getting feedback from each other. But that's where you're going to get the feedback from me saying, well, before you give me your final prototype, you need to fix these things, right? Okay? So it's really important to try to get your initial prototype right, because we're incrementally building on it in the class. Okay?
But we can't get 100.
It's possible to get 100 if you do high quality work. Okay?
We need to do something like
any other questions?
home screen.
Yes,
Okay,
sorry. I need one question
make sure
before.
like I need a bubble, like a red dot, green dot, or yellow dot. So you can do like the interact status of the whole
A
thing.
lot of you are going to have forms
And if there
as
are
part of your
more than one
right? So what you can do
point
to
issue,
simulate
then
that
show
is
2
show
or
a
3,
blank form,
depending
and
on
then
the
when the user clicks in any of the fields, then show the next one form fields filled in. Okay? So you don't actually have to figure out how to simulate typing. The only thing I want to warn you is when you do an app that's like all forms and then just like display afterwards, that tends to not be so useful for the user. So like, for instance, last semester there was one group who was doing a car app for managing the miles that your car goes and calculating things like gas mileage and maintenance records. A problem that they had is, one, they tried to do it by the GPS locator. What's the problem with that? Like, if you're riding as a passenger, it might put miles on your car, if you're doing this or that. So, part of it was, it's not feasible to use the GPS locator to measure, like, for your car, unless, like, you did something intelligent, like, turned on Bluetooth and made sure it's connected to the app. The other thing they tried to do is have this form to fill in, like, your mileage, and then fix all of the incorrect data. Is that something that you want to do? So one of the things I suggested to them, because they had this big form-based system, is, well, what if you had some like OCR recognition, and all they needed to do was, when they stopped to fill up for gas, They just took a picture of their odometer. Odometer is the one that's the miles per hour, or is it the odometer, and have that convert to numeric data and save the timestamp and use that as the basis of your mileage instead. It's simpler, it requires less form input, and it doesn't deal a lot with really bad data, right? OCR technology is pretty good these days. I mean, unless your odometer is like really old or something like that. So try to stay away from apps that just have a lot of menu buttons and a lot of forms. And if there's a way to cut back on input, then that's always a good thing, right? By trying to automate some of the input for the user so that they don't have to sit and enter in all this input to be able to get something simple like a reminder, right? Okay. All good questions. Any other questions? Yes.
My team has a question about so since the deliverable is just a prototype, how are we supposed to authenticate?
So I suggested it in the in-class assignment. Ways to contribute is, for instance, the project manager is going to coordinate everything. The business analyst can work to do some QA testing of the app, like actually going through it and say, hey, this is inconsistent, you need to fix this. The technical writers can be in charge of doing the design justifications. The graphic designer is obviously going to, hopefully you have more than one graphic designer because it's a lot of work for your graphic designer. And then if there's other team members, guess what? Do we want the graphic designer hooking up all the PowerPoint slides or have somebody else? So that would be a great way to split everything up. Okay? So please make sure you're all contributing because for your final prototype, when I actually grade it, because I'm not going to grade that 20% until I get the other 80%. But in that assignment, I'm going to have your little group rubric where your project manager says, here's what's everybody's contribution. So I'm not going to drop that for this assignment either. Okay? All right. The other thing I want to remind you is I believe today is the last day to withdraw. So if you are one of the people who are considering that due to your P1 and your exam grades that you've gotten so far, you're welcome to come talk to me after class about what your options are and make the best decision for you. All right, so today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, Evaluating Interface Design. And I saved this chapter, even though it was one of the earlier chapters, until you actually had an interface to actually evaluate. So that's what we're going to be talking about now. What the book does poorly is tell you actually how to evaluate your interfaces. So next week, I'm going to go into more details on the how. The book chapter just gives you more of a conceptual overview of what we mean by evaluation. Alright, so again, reminder, your mobile app prototype is due on Thursday. I don't even know why I asked this, because everybody always says yes. But if I extended that again to like a Sunday, would that be helpful?
Yes.
Okay. So, just like I teased you last time, I'm going to tease you again this time, and Thursday, on the day it's due, we will do an in-class check again to make sure how you're doing, because just like last time, I kicked myself because I'm like, oh, I shouldn't even mention it because I want them to keep working on it. Do not procrastinate with the hope that I'm going to accept this. Please. Please. Okay? Is that a good?
I think we'll have Rada show us in on Thursday. Yeah, exactly.
Right, the prototype should take longer than the video demo because once you have the prototype, the key thing in the video demo is doing it at like a professional quality level where it's not just a whole bunch of ums and uhs and you don't have a cohesive thing what you're saying, that you actually have introduction slides instead of just saying, here's our demo. And then we're just like, oh, what? Who was a target audience, right? All right. So just keep that in the back of your mind as a vague hope, but I'll revisit it again on Thursday. But again, you should be working on your prototypes now. You should have been working on them the last few weeks. All right. So this is the slide that I put in that's not at all related to the textbook. But what I realize as a person who is in human-computer interaction is that the biggest key to effective evaluation is what? On the slide. Humility. What is humility? Is anybody a fan of like Greek literature and hubris? What is hubris? Arrogance, pride, and in Greek literature, what is it? Like, what's the theme? Right? It is the downfall of man, right? Okay, anyway, that's a little bit too much on the drama side. In HCI and user-centered design, who's it all about? The user. So it's like minimizing yourself and putting your user on a pedestal, right? And that requires a lot of humility, doesn't it? Because as STEM majors, we tend to think, well, we know more about computers. We understand the algorithms behind the scenes. We understand the architecture. Therefore, we know best for when we're designing the interface for the user. And what happens when you have that mentality?
You're willing to listen.
You're not willing to listen. You're designing something for yourself. What else? The best way to make sure that you don't learn anything new is what? To think you already know everything. Right. So even just doing a very simple study. For instance, I was going to do a research study on the benefits of using assistive technologies for the elderly and for their caregivers. I was up for this grant funding. We were finalists, and we went into the room. And before we went into the room, we didn't realize that the people who had the money were actually old people. I found this out when the guy who came to collect us for our interviews came in, and he was bringing us back, and he's just like, you have to speak up because some of our hearing aids don't work very well. And that was when I was like, oh, I didn't quite prepare to talk to the audience that I was studying. I thought they were like other researchers like me. Well, I went into the room and proposed, well, we're interested in interviewing caregivers about how they use technology, and what do you think the feedback was from this group of people?
Negative.
It was a lot of caregivers are overburdened. They don't want to use technology. They don't want to use technology on us. And like, this isn't going to work. And what do you think? Did we get the funding? No. No. Okay. So if I had known that that was the audience that I was walking into, and if I would have known before that their stance on it was going to be fairly negative, I could have posed my introduction a little differently. I could have said, you know, I'm interested in studying the barriers of adoption to technology because the technology solutions that we're providing to the caregivers aren't meeting your needs and are making your life more complex, and we want to solve that. What do you think? Do you think the response would have been a little bit more positive? So a lot of times it's about understanding and knowing your users. And even for a researcher like me, when I'm thinking, yeah, I'm a finalist for this grant, there are a lot of humbling moments out there where you have to swallow your pride and say, okay, I didn't account for that. I didn't realize that. What are some surprises that you got from talking to your target user? Like, what are some of those humbling times? Nothing? you're the study click, right? So teens in high school, so they care more about privacy than like socially connecting, and so you have to take those things into consideration, right?
We want to be more heavy-handed with like privacy management. So we have a question that says, we want to throw our privacy, we are probably have to just trust them with what we have.
Okay. Right, so actually younger generations are actually better at managing their privacy settings than a lot of older generations. Okay, anything else? Sarah?
I know that we went into the interviews expecting like the children were having issues with math, and then we were very surprised to find out that they were actually had issues with reading. That was like not on our radar at all.
Right.
So just those.
And so if you were tunnel vision on building an app to help kids learn math, and you didn't listen to your users when they said that, you would have been designing a completely different app that might not have met your users' needs. Okay. So while I understand you probably got more feedback from your PD1 than you've gotten for any of your assignments at UCF, the whole exercise was to show you kind of the range of feedback. Where the students that peer evaluated you probably tend to be very positive. The TAs were more tactical because they were grading based on like certain things I was having them look at. And my feedback was more like high level, like, hey, you have a conceptual problem with your app, or you need to reframe or rescope or do this or that, right? And was some of that feedback hard to read?
Not really.
No? Good. Because for some of you, I know it was. Okay? And realize that that's how it works in my field. Is that I'm building an app for Facebook to understand the whole launch of reactions, and I just sent it out to 10 beta testers. The first one gave me a comment like, hey, I was able to go through the study, no problem, but I wasn't sure if I installed the app correctly. Because the only thing that you have to do to install the app is sign in to Facebook, and it installs it behind the scenes. There's nothing that says this app has successfully been installed. So, like, while I'm just like, okay, well, that's a minor thing. Well, we probably need to address that because this user's having a problem. My second beta tester, I sent it to her, and she said, hey, sorry, but I can't access your study because my antivirus software is saying it's malicious app. And I'm just like, oh, come on. Can you just add it to the trusted sites? But then I have to say, this user doesn't know how to do that, and most of the other users who are going to be my beta testers aren't going to know how to do that either. So we're in the process of buying a new domain name that is more trustworthy, because we have it on a .info domain name, which tends to be less trusted and blocked more frequently by some of the spyware or antivirus software. And this is just and then the first user who tested it for me said, hey, I got a page that said timed out. And so we actually had to move the development of the app to a different server because the server that we had it on was running too slow. Those are my first 3 testers. And nobody said, hey, everything worked fine. And so that gets really pressing after a while, but then you can see the light at the end of the tunnel to say, hey, now I have this app that I know is fairly user-friendly because I finally get a group of people who said, hey, this was great, it was a great experience, and we're hoping that, it goes viral on Facebook. Okay? So, spending a lot of time here, but it's really important to be able to listen to the feedback of your users and try to solve their problem. Because one user is having that problem, others will probably have it as well. And sometimes it might be user error, and you need to address that as well, but don't be defensive when you first start and say, well, that's the user's problem. Okay? So the importance of design evaluation is actually quite broad. It's one that designers can be too close to the system to evaluate it objectively. For instance, there's one group in here that both the TA and I independently said that their icon looked like a menorah. Who's in that group? Anybody from Streamline? And it was funny because the graphic designer laughed and said, now I can see that, right? So sometimes you just need to have another pair of eyes look at it because you've gotten too close to it. Also, companies are realizing that failing to evaluate their systems before they're launched can be disastrous. Most companies have QA testing. What's QA testing? Okay, quality assurance, where you get the requirements analysis or requirements documentation, the developer develops to that, somebody creates test scripts, and then the QA tester actually tests with fake data to make sure that it was developed to the specs. Do most companies have usability testing or user acceptance testing? No. There are actually more companies who have it than used to have it, but for the large part, companies that are like small to mid-size don't have usability labs for their users to say, okay, before we launch, what do you think of this system? Okay. Mostly only the high-tech companies or the big banks or maybe big hospitals, very large organizations with deeper pockets can afford those type of resources. So that's one of the reasons that I'm starting a UX lab here at UCF in order to reach out to those small and mid-sized companies to have students like you do some usability testing for those companies. If that's something that you'd be interested in joining and participating in future semesters, please send me an email because we're trying to get that launched. And evaluation should be done iteratively, not just once the system has already been built. Okay? So we're not getting to the point of like participatory design where your users are part of your design team, but checking in with your users after you have a working prototype, maybe before you invest thousands or millions of dollars into actual code. Okay? And so, just 10 years ago, some of these concepts were very foreign to people, like users testing. What's so important in that? But because users are more demanding and want more user-friendly and intuitive features that meet their needs, this is very important to do. And it's the marketing folks and the tech support folks who realize how important it is because they're the ones who interface with the actual customers. So some of the determinants of what a company does for their evaluation plan include what stage of design. For instance, formative design is when you really don't even know what this thing looks like yet, and you're still trying to nail down what features should go in it. And then more summative, where you're near the end of the design process, you know what your application or your system is supposed to do, and it's just a matter of now fine-tuning. Okay? So if you're in the formative stage, you probably want to do more prototyping because you might be changing things so frequently you don't want to have a working implemented prototype. So there's things like the novelty of the project. Well, if it's a well-defined task that you work really closely with the customer, with the internal customer in your company to define, it's easy to get in front of those users and ask for feedback. Whereas if it's more of an exploratory task, like you're building something that's novel for new users who've never used it before, it makes it a lot harder to do evaluation as the project progresses. The number of expected users, because your target audience might be small. It might be an app just for a particular demographic that has the pockets to fund it for sustainability. Or it might be broad, where you want all users to be able to use this app. So you have to pick users who can evaluate based on who your target audience is. The criticality of the interface, meaning, for instance, if you're building something that is life critical, like an emergency alert system, you better bet you want to do a lot more testing than if you're doing something for the fire department that's just managing the pantry budget, right? So if you have an app that's actually a way for firefighters to get to their route to go put out a fire, you're going to do a lot more evaluations than you would for making sure they have enough money to buy cereal, right? The cost of the system. Obviously, if this project is going to be $1 million project, you want to invest some money in user acceptance to make sure that you're going to get the ROI that you expect. But if it's a small little utility app that one developer could put together in a weekend, and they just want to launch it in the wild and say, hey, let's see what people think of this, that's low risk because it's low investment. Funds set aside for evaluation. A lot of times, the UX people in companies are often the developers who say, we need to do this. And sometimes developers have to be the ones to evangelize their companies onto the importance of actually putting investment in evaluation by users. Because the management might also have the tunnel thinking of, hey, we know what the users want, therefore let's define it. The time available. For instance, if you have a dead set deadline and you run out of time for evaluation and you've already spent a lot of money, you might not evaluate. And then the experience of the design and evaluation team. So a lot of people say that they know interface design, but when they say that, and I ask them some questions, it becomes very clear that they know it from the perspective of the developer, where they can use Bootstrap, they can use all these different tools to build interfaces. But when I ask them if they've ever done an evaluation with users, if they've ever done a survey to measure perceived measures and figured out the constructs of interest, and I get blank stares, I realize that they're not UX designer people. And if I've ever asked them if they've ever done an interview with a participant or a think aloud study and I get blank stares, I realize that, okay, well, they know how to develop interfaces. They don't necessarily know how to make sure that the user is going to accept them. There's also a lot of limitations of evaluation. So, for instance, all evaluation techniques may overlook critical problems, right? Because when you're testing a prototype, you're doing it out of the context of how it would typically be used, right? And so, for instance, one team last semester created a widget for a driving app. And their whole idea was to have, in one convenient widget, the entire UCF map and showing the traffic on campus so that when you're driving around, it could do real-time updates. What was the major issue with that?
Too much load on the user.
Too much load on the user, because here I have to figure out, one, where I am on this UCF map. Two, how big is your phone screen? And are you driving? Because that's the whole purpose of the app. And so now you're looking at the entire UCF campus on your phone screen on an app. Is that safe for driving? No. So testing it in the classroom and saying, oh, that's a really cool prototype might be one thing. Actually getting out on the road and trying to see if it's as useful is another. Okay? Also, performance is unpredictable, and evaluation may not test all possible conditions. For instance, over time. When I first downloaded that baby feed app, it was awesome because I was able to do everything really easily and record my baby's feeds and poops and all that fun stuff. But over time, the problem that app continually had is that the way it syncs the data was it would just randomly, when I would make a change, push everything up to the cloud to back it up, but it would give me a syncing notification and not allow me to do anything. And the way it synced the data was that it would upload everything from all my entries since the beginning of time, every time, instead of just uploading what I had entered since the last time. So what do you think the user experience looked like over time? Exactly. So the longer I used the app, the more annoying it became because the syncing, like I literally logged something and then it would pop up that it was syncing. And then after it was done syncing, I would realize that it didn't log what I logged in to do because it was syncing. And that became really annoying. Okay, so you have to take ideas such as those. Also, finding the right objective measures for success is difficult, right? For more routinized tasks, it might be the time to complete. But for a social media app or an app for teen mental health, it might be something that's more of a perceived measure, like sense of community, right? And so evaluation metrics are tricky. Also, perfection is not possible, and at some point the system has to be launched, right? that I'm kind of annoyed because the person who's developing it hasn't fixed them. But I'm to the point where, okay, if I keep telling her that all these problems are here and we never launch this app, we're never going to get the research done. So at some point you have to have an idea of, okay, this is good enough. All right. So this chapter goes into a whole bunch of different evaluation approaches that are available to UA, user acceptance testing and evaluation. And we're going to talk about these more at the high level of the concepts. So what I would do on your cheat sheet is actually write the definitions for these different ones and just listen in class to make sure you understand the differences between them. So if you had a multiple choice question. So one of the things is there's things that are appropriate for pre-launch of an app or an application, and there's things that are more appropriate for post-launch. For instance, data logging of actual usage behaviors would be something that you would do post-launch, because you're not going to be able to log usage patterns and behaviors if you don't have a system already, right? Okay. So expert reviews, and that's what you're going to be doing in class, is because now that you've taken this class and have all of these design guidelines, we're considering you experts in HCI guidelines for design. This is where designers and experts in HCI provide constructive feedback to improve the system based on the types of things that you've learned. Like, for instance, when you're evaluating a system now, what are some of the guidelines or principles you've learned? Give the user multiple ways to do something. When they take an action, give them feedback to let them know that it was successful. Make the features that are available to them accessible and visible. Okay. Create easily reversible. Okay. So all of these things that we've learned, we want to look for in the design of a good interface. Okay. There's also usability testing, is when you actually do the system evaluation with your target users. Okay. So instead of the experts giving you an evaluation, actually put it in front of a user to make sure that they are able to successfully complete your tasks as you think they should. Surveys and interviews, like a web-based survey collecting qualitative feedback from users or quantitative even. Have them go through
That's why you use UCF. You use UCF twice. UCF twice.
Or you can do something like a qualitative
interview,
having them walk through your prototype and ask them, what are the main issues that you have with it? Or do you have any suggestions for improvement? Questions that you tend to not want to ask, especially if you're going to them saying, I just spent half the semester developing this prototype, can you evaluate it for me, please? And then you ask them, so what did you think of the app? Would you use an app like this? What do you think you're going to hear back? Right, that's an interviewer-based bias. Like, for instance, if I sat here in the middle of class and asked Joe, how do you like my class? And he is an instructor, right? Exactly. So, it's called
They're super freaking slow.
And then, so you have to, for instance, when you give a user a prototype, you try to detach yourself from it. Say, well, my company gave me this prototype that I need to evaluate for them to figure out how to make it better. Could you please help me evaluate it? Take out the mind and the meaning and my hard work, so people don't think that they're going to offend you if they say something negative, right? Data logging, where you build in mechanisms for tracking usage. For instance, there's feature creep in most software packages, and one of the ways that Google determines what features they're going to support moving forward is they might track the usage of certain things, and they say, okay, only 2% of our users use this feature, therefore we're just going to drop it and not support it. Or you can build in mechanisms for logging errors. We do this a lot when we're systems admins, right? When there's a problem and it comes across the network, we actually log that to try to say, okay, this is what we need to fix. You can do that in user design as well. For
30.
Because along that, you can figure out, okay, well, when are they making their errors? It depends on the context. Have you ever thought of tech support and being able to get user feedback on things like forums, a way to inform design? Have any of you worked in tech support before? So, was there a common problem that people had with the interface that you were supporting? Any other thoughts? What is your name for something like that? Nick. Right. Have you rebooted? Right. So, a way to make design better would be if somebody was getting a constant error message, maybe building it in a prompt to the error message saying, please try rebooting your computer. Like, it depends on what you're doing.
So you had somebody else? Did you get another one? You were in front of me? Yes, brother.
Right. Right. That's probably not
My kid.
so one of the things you can do is when they successfully change their password, have a message for them to make it more user friendly, and then run an export call. Say, please log out of your federated identity and reboot your computer before trying to use the system. And how many calls would like that? Right. Okay. User-generated discussions. So, has anybody ever successfully contacted Google to get tech support for something? How did you do it? Oh, okay.
You have to Google contact him.
Okay, because I was using Google Voice to record interviews, and my phone kept eating my interviews, and for the life of me, I could not find a way to actually talk to an actual person at Google. But what they do have are these extensive lists of forums where sometimes somebody official gets on them and jumps on and answers a question. But the great thing about these forums is that they can be mined for data. And if a user is having a consistent problem, like eating my Google Voice recordings, then they might be able, if they didn't own the world, to be take initiative to fix those user issues before a larger number of people have that problem. So listening to the problems that people are having, then this is a post-launch type of evaluation method. There's automated tools for data logging, where you can actually buy a package that you can integrate with your software. And then there's control experiments, which we do a lot in the research world, that and psychology does a lot, but probably if you go in the industry, you might not do a controlled experiment as much, where you have like maybe one version of an interface, you make a small tweak, and then you have a control and experimental group to see if there's any significant differences statistically in performance or other measures. All right, so these slides, I can actually branch over a lot of them because a lot of them just go more details than what I just talked about. So expert reviews is having somebody with expertise in design or the task domain provide feedback. The good thing about expert reviews is that they don't take as long as if you wanted to get actual target users to come in and use your prototype and evaluate it. You would just have these people in your network, especially if you're a UX designer. So it doesn't take as long to do it, and it's more of just the partner or the colleague to say, hey, have you considered about doing this or that? Some of the limitations, though, is that because they're also experts, and if they're experts in the task domain, they may also be too biased towards your design. For instance, if you both come from the same field and do things the same way, it might not be different enough to represent a novice user. Okay? They also might not have experience in the task domain. They might have design experience but have no idea the task that you're trying to complete. They may also not have a clear understanding of the target users, which is one of the reasons in your video demo, one of the first things that you need to enter for us because sometimes we say, here's this great app, but you don't say, oh, it's for the elderly, or for its teens, it's for disabled children. And somebody's just thinking this is for the everyday user, they might say, oh, that's completely not useful. Why do I need a dumb phone? Okay. Maybe viewing the system outside the real-world context, again, one of the limitations of evaluation. And different experts are going to have different and often conflicting opinions. How many of the reviews that you got back had some of those? Okay. And that's common because especially people who are considered experts tend to be very opinionated. Okay? And so sometimes you have to justify when you go with one opinion versus another in a way that says, okay, well, this is the reason we chose to do it this way. Okay? So these are some of the types of expert reviews. There are heuristic evaluations. Remember those 8 golden rules of interface design that we covered? Actually going through each screen and the prototype as a whole, keeping in mind just one rule at a time, and this is what you're going to do with your classmate's prototype, and saying, okay, did they violate this guideline? Did they violate this guideline? Did they violate this guideline? And recording any potential issues. Okay. The heuristic evaluation guidelines often vary based on the task domain. Like, for instance, if it's a mobile app, it might be different than a web app. Okay. There's also guideline reviews. So remember, step 2 in the design process, which is the documentation and guidelines, have different companies have different standards. For instance, the medical field has HIPAA, and the education field has FERPA, which are the guidelines regulating privacy and data security. And if your app was in one of those fields, you had a big note from me saying you must address this. Okay. There's also consistency inspection. Verifying the consistency across a set of related systems. Consistency can apply to anything. It could be the font that you're using, it could be the wording, it could be the color scheme, it could be the layout of your icons. If something's inconsistent from one screen to the next or across your entire app, from, like, for instance, if you're developing an iPhone app and it looks more like an Android app, it's not consistent with your users' expectations. So try to maintain consistency whenever possible, and that's really hard to do, right? There's cognitive walkthroughs, which is the other thing that we're going to go through in class, is where you simulate walking a novice user, somebody who's never seen your system before, through the steps of completing your main task. And for each step, you ask 4 different questions to say, okay, is this intuitive? Is this what I would expect? And we'll go over that in the next lecture. And this is a very systematic way to see if the workflow is intuitive of your design. There's metaphors of human thinking, which I've never seen anybody use this, but it's conducting an inspection of how users think when interacting with the interface. And then there's formal usability inspections, which this just seems like a nightmare to me, where you actually have a courtroom-style meeting with a moderator, and then people discuss your interface as if you were in a courtroom, and actually take more of an adversarial approach of trying to tear it apart. Can you imagine if we did that in the classroom? First of all, you guys would have a really hard time doing that because you're very nice to each other. But I would tend to not go towards this because it's better to give constructive criticism than it is to try to tear your colleagues apart.
So what we're doing, which one is the best way to do it?
So what we're going to do for class is we're going to go through a heuristic evaluation, and then we're going to go through a cognitive walkthrough. Okay. So now usability testing, which is different than expert reviews have. Right?
You have a target audience UX expert?
Very good. Usability testing led to what's called usability labs, and even banks and hospitals and other big tech companies have these now, where they actually can bring in users to do kind of focus groups. And it's not just for like marketing research anymore. It's actually to hit and play with a newly proposed interface to see the user's response. So it's kind of like marketing research, but for interface interaction. However, when we start to do things like usability testing, and we're actually using real users, that highlights the need for having clear ethical standards of how we do this. For instance, has anybody heard of Milgram's obedience shock experiment that was conducted back in the, I don't remember, like 60s or so? What happened?
They were told to shock the patient or whatever until they.
Right. So Milgram also did the prison experiment too. So, and this is one of the big rises for the Institutional Review Board, which exists at every university. Anytime we do research with human subjects, we have to submit how and what we're going to do to make sure that we're not putting the subject at harm. So Milgram did 2 classic experiments, one where he put people in a prison environment and saw how their behaviors changed, which was really crazy. And then a shock experiment where he told somebody and used deception that you're going to shock this person over here and just push this button. And people actually did it. It was kind of the whole bystander effect that they were trying to measure. What he did that was deceptive is he wasn't actually shocking people. The people were actors. But it harms people emotionally because they're trying to understand like how things like the Holocaust and Hitler could come around because people were just blindly following orders that physically could harm other people. So we have what's called IRB and ethical standards now, because if we don't, people do some really crappy things with subjects who don't realize that they're being tested. For instance, has anybody seen the big conflict about the Facebook experiments? Yeah. See? Love how you said that. Emotional manipulation. So, I actually know some of the researchers who were part of that study. They did not get consent because they argued that you being on Facebook and accepting the terms of service meant that you agreed to be in any research that they conduct on Facebook. So what they did is they took a subset of people and they only showed the more negative comments that your friends posted within a certain period of time. And then they scraped all of your reactions or your comments from it to see if the people in this treatment group actually started having a more negative affect over time by only seeing the negative things from their friends. And they did find a significant relationship where if you see more negative things, you tend to become more negative. Well, what are some of the far-reaching implications of a study like that? What if you were already severely depressed and you were a teen? Right, so it could have actually pushed somebody over the edge to commit suicide, right? And so then what the researchers went back and said is like, oh, well, everybody knows the terms of service, and they said, and the effect wasn't so strong that it should have any kind of risk on users. But the thing is, they didn't know that when they set out to study it. They would only know that after they examined the results. So there's this big try to action of, Facebook can't just use us as a big lab rat experiment. Okay. There are different types of usability testing, and I actually like combining these two. There's think aloud techniques where you actually have the user perform a task with the software or a prototype. Thinking aloud, saying, okay, I'm going to click here. Well, it looks like I should do this, but I'm not sure. And you hear something like, well, I'm not sure. What should that key you to? Oh, there might be an intuition or usability issue here. Or like, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I thought it was to do this. Okay, maybe you used the wrong visual metaphor. So having them think aloud is a really beneficial thing because when you just see them clicking, you have no idea why. So the thinking aloud helps give you some of the rationale behind users' behaviors. Okay? The problem, though, with think aloud studies is that they often increase cognitive load. Because how hard is it for you to do a task and talk at the same time? It's hard, yeah. Right. There's also things like mock-up and prototyping. Prototyping is a big thing that we've done in this class. I know some of you don't like the level of work we're doing in this class. It gets too much. But I benchmarked with some of my colleagues at other universities, like University of Minnesota, and she told me Could you imagine doing all of that and the design aspects for this class? That would be a lot of work, right? So the reason I take out the implementation phase is because you do implementation in your other classes, and I want you to focus on the design aspects. And I think adding the extra workload of actual implementation would be very difficult to do in one semester. All right. There's also competitive usability testing, which is comparing a new interface to a previous version. The important thing here, though, is you have to have interfaces that are at the same level of completion. For instance, you wouldn't have somebody go through an app that's out on the Android marketplace and your PowerPoint prototype because they're apples and oranges, right? Okay. But this is a great way to see if your design is more intuitive than maybe your competitors. There's universal usability testing, where you test the interface with a highly diverse crowd of target users, meaning that you're making it more generalizable and you'll find more issues, like for instance, people who use small screens and large screens, people who have sight visions or who know how to use technology and who don't know how to use technology. And they'll all come back with different types of issues to be able to say, okay, this is what we need to do to widen our audience for accessibility and universal usability. And then there's field tests and portable labs, where you actually try to bring this out into the wild, have users use a new system in a realistic setting, and give it to a company, have it launched in a mock day, where they use it as their replacement for their old system, just like they would use it. And then use logging software to capture their behavior. So instead of asking them interview questions or having them think aloud, which would reduce the usability, which would reduce the realistic context, actually just try to observe or maybe have video cameras. Okay, so you're not changing their behavior by making them do something different. There's remote usability testing by doing it online. There's a lot of times you can upload a prototype online, have them go through, do a task, and then maybe do a survey afterwards. And then one that originated from game design and kind of hackathons and things like that are, can you break this testing? Get a group of students who like to hack into things and see if you can actually break the system. So this is like break testing. And if you can't break it, then you're considered successful. All right. So some of the limitations of usability testing include that it emphasizes first-time use only and doesn't take into account usage over time, right? Because they're first getting familiar with the system, using it for the first time, and so you're not simulating what it would be using it 1 or even 6 months when you're up. It provides limited interface features. So all of you in your PD1 have apps that do a lot more than you're going to prototype, right? So would you prototype all of your functionality before you start development? Probably not, right? Because you know there's some features that are more minor that you want in your app that you don't need to get user acceptance on as long as they accept the main thing that they're going to be using this for. Okay? So a lot of times prototypes, when you have a user look at it, you give them a well-defined task. You don't have them touch 100% coverage of the interface. Testing environment is inherently different than the real world. We talked about that before. And then knowing that you're being tested changes people's behavior, right? So anytime somebody volunteers for a study or knows that they're being studied, realize that changes behavior. Right. There's also surveys and related ways to collect feedback. So some of the limitations of surveys, which I try not to use for trying to evaluate systems, is that they're trying to get people to use recall to remember their past behaviors and what they did and what they were thinking, as opposed to recognition or like in the moment response. So that tends to be less accurate than asking them to think aloud.
I'm going to talk to her after class. First thing for my main ideas, make sure I'm on the right track.
It may also not be effective in collecting data on their actual interaction with the system. People say one thing, but they actually do another. And then requires careful consideration of the questions that you ask. Okay? So, for instance, you have to ask open-ended questions, or make sure your questions don't have inherent bias. Or when you ask a question, it has to have what's called statistical construct validity, which you guys don't have to worry about, but I have to in my research. So when I craft a survey for research purposes, I have to make sure that what I'm measuring actually measures that like underlying psychological construct, which can be a big deal. So some design guidelines for surveys, keeping in mind for your exam, but you're not going to be doing it in this class, is that they should be tested by experts and pilot users prior to launch. You don't want to ask a question if you're not going to know what to do with the data. For instance, some of you ask questions in your semi-structured interviews that you asked and you got a response for, but then it didn't have any bearing on your design or implications. So it was just basically filler. Designers should also have a plan for how you're going to analyze your data. The first thing that happens with a new PhD student is they want to design a web-based survey because it's the fastest way to collect data. And then they get this big data set and they come to me saying, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to analyze this. So have a plan. Are you going to do descriptive statistics of percentages of this or the mean and the standard deviation? Are you going to do inferential statistics, looking at the relationships between different variables, like a regression analysis, where you have independent variables that predict dependent variables? Are you going to have qualitative themes, where you have interview data, and you analyze the similarities and the differences across 5 different users? Okay? So having a plan for how you analyze the data is very important before you collect it. And then also determining the key information you want to solicit from users in order to craft useful questions. So a lot of you got a few points taken off on your PD1 because you gave me the questions that you asked without any kind of justification of why you were asking each question. Okay. The book does talk briefly about pre-validated usability questionnaires. So there's been a lot of research to show how you can measure if a system is useful or user-friendly. And we use that in research, but you're probably not going to use that unless you become more of a researcher. And then there's other evaluation mechanisms talked about in the book. We talked about interviews, focus groups, data logging. There's also online telephone and other feedback that kind of talks to support and online forums, group discussions. And then the book at the end talks about section 4.7 about psychological experiments. Skip that section because we're not going to be doing any controlled psychological experiments, and unless you want to go to grad school, you probably won't be doing those. All right. Acceptance testing is something that you should give consideration to, where you set an objective and measurable goal as a threshold for launching the system. Because everybody complains that design is so subjective and you can never get it perfect, you have to at least have some kind of metric of saying, okay, well, what are we going to define as success so that it doesn't change over time because we just want to keep getting it perfect. Okay? So think about measurable criteria, such as time to learn, speed of task performance, rate of error. And here are some example statements that you could use if you're thinking about doing a usability test for your app. For instance, users will be able to perform blank tasks using our high-fidelity prototype. So that's like a Boolean value of they were able to complete or they were not able to complete the task, right? Users should be able to complete the task without getting any guidance from the design team beyond the initial description of the task that they are to perform. That's pretty objective, right? They should be able to complete the task within blank seconds. During the Think Aloud session, users will utter less than blank questions regarding navigation, like how do I do this or do that? Users will utter less than blank criticisms regarding the interface, and you have to be very, very broad when you think of criticism. Criticism might be like, oh, that's not what I thought, and it's still a criticism that you can address. Or users will report a level of severity associated, and then finally you have users report a level of severity associated with any problems they encountered. For instance, once they do a think aloud study, you can say, okay, well, these are the issues that I just saw that you encountered. Could you please rate them based on like the level of severity, based on how difficult it made the system to use? Okay. So for your project, some of the things that would be feasible to do are paper mock-ups and prototyping, which you're doing your PowerPoint prototypes, and think aloud techniques. I think I'm going to put together a usability test as a potential extra credit assignment. I know we don't have time to build that into our main class because we're going to be focusing more on consistency as part of the heuristic evaluation and doing cognitive walkthroughs. So I'm going to pair your groups in groups of 3 or 4 to evaluate one another's designs by doing cognitive walkthroughs and heuristic evaluations. I'm going to have you come to class and exchange the necessary information, and I'll give you templates for doing your evaluations. But then in class, you're going to have to get together with those different groups. The project manager should get the contact information of the other team's project managers so you can coordinate things. So that other group has all the necessary information they need to be able to go home and individually